We're a week away from the midterm elections, and this last month we've been focusing on how we as a church and how we as Christians can be a part of healing our very divided country. And as I've been thinking about that, I was thinking about Abraham Lincoln and his second inaugural address. And you talk about a time when the world or our country was divided. Today is nothing compared to what happened in 1861 to 1865 when America was fighting against itself. We became two nations for a time. 620,000 American soldiers on the Confederacy and on the Union armies killed one another. They died on the battlefields in this war. If you take that same percentage of the population, you bring it to today, if we had a civil war like that today, 6 million Americans would have died if the Civil War were fought today, 2% of the population. And so we see this terrible tragedy and all the pain and brokenness and the anger and the vitriol. But Abraham Lincoln knew that the war was nearly over. He understood, he could see the handwriting on the wall. And a month later, Robert E. Lee would be surrendering his army. And then the other generals or leaders of the various parts of the Confederate Army would surrender over the next month after that. He could see that. Everyone knew this was coming. And so at this point, at his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln is interested in how do we heal our divide? How do we heal our country? He's got wisdom to offer us in our divided times. And by the way, it's interesting, there's like 43% of Americans who think that a civil war in America is actually possible, somewhat likely at least, in the next 10 years. I don't believe that we'll have another civil war, but I think it's possible if we don't do something to address our polarization and the way we address one another and the way we do our politics. We might just find ourselves in serious trouble in the future. That's why the Be campaign is so important. That's why every 2 years are coming together to say, how can we be instruments of healing? How can we be bridge builders? What do we have to do ourselves to be able to address the brokenness in our country? I think the church has a critical role to play. The second inaugural address is only 4 paragraphs long. It's only about 7 minutes. And while he's speaking, part of what Abraham Lincoln does is he acknowledges the fact that there were people on both sides who were Christians. He acknowledges the fact that, this is what he says, both the Union and the Confederacy read from the same Bible and they pray to the same God, and each invokes God's aid against the other. And then he says, speaking to the North, speaking to the Union, he says, let us judge not that we be not judged. He's quoting from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and 6 times at least in this short message, Abraham Lincoln draws from allusions to Scripture. He's drawing upon these scriptural ideas. He's trying to be a healer and invite the North to be instruments of God's healing for the country. He's quite explicit in naming the injustice. So it's not like he's saying, let's just all love each other and not talk about the differences we have and not talk about the injustice. No, he names it. He names it really seriously. He talks about, the judgment of God on the practice of slavery. And so he's clear that this is a wrong, but he doesn't blame the South for this. He doesn't point out he doesn't try to demonize the South in the midst of pointing out where they disagreed and what was wrong. Instead, he's trying to throw an olive branch at them. He's trying to find a way to bring these people who had waged war, who had seceded, and with the North waging war against the South against the North, he's trying to bring them together. But he doesn't de-emphasize the fact that slavery was unjust and wrong. And then he says this, and this is the most famous line from the second inaugural address. We find it on the inside wall of the Lincoln Memorial. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in, to bind up the nation's wound, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphans, to do all which we may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. What's fascinating about this is he's speaking to the North about how they're going to be engaged in healing, not only the North, but also in healing the South and being instruments of healing. He's drawing upon Scripture to call people to do this. And in this statement, though this was the bloodiest and most tragic conflict in the history of our nation, he's calling people in the North to eliminate ill will towards the South and instead to replace that with charity. Malice towards none, charity towards all. The word charity comes from the Latin word caritas. And this Latin word caritas is the word that when the New Testament was translated from the Greek into the Latin, it's the word that replaced the word. It's the Latin equivalent, roughly, of the Greek word agape. In most cases, that's the word that's used. Caritas, charity. Charity is not just helping the poor. It's living out a life of love towards all who need it. In that way, it's much like Hesed in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Lincoln saw it was the work of the people, the hard work of the people, to practice love towards those who had been their enemies. And he saw that this was, in fact, the message of Jesus. And he draws from James, which we studied last month, and he mentioned specifically caring for the widows and orphans, not just those in the north, but those in the south. And that it was this these acts of kindness, this act of doing that was going to be the primary instrument of healing that would ultimately bring about a just and lasting peace, Abraham Lincoln said. An August 2020 survey by YouGov and The Economist found that 43% of Americans do think that another civil war is on the horizon. I simply don't believe that's true. I choose not to believe that's true. And at the same time, I recognize that anything can happen. And because of that, we're conducting these campaigns every 2 years to say, let's be a part of ensuring that doesn't happen. Let's practice no malice, but instead charity towards all people.